Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. Today, we have a special guest and we're going to have a special discussion, a very interesting topic. Before we go into the topic discussion, I want to give a brief introduction about IMD and Voice of Men 360 and talk about our shows, what we are focusing actually right now. So, Voice of Men 360 is a non-profit organization based in Toronto, Canada, recently started. And we are following IMD food step, which is six pillars. IMD International Men's Day has been serving more than 20 years. This year, 2020, is the 21st year. And about 90 countries, nearly 90 countries joined together. And then they are taking initiatives or doing a number of activities on a regular basis. So let me share the six pillars which IMD follows. The six pillars of International Men's Day: to promote positive male role models, not just movie stars and sportsmen, but everyday working class men who are living decent and honest lives. Number two, to celebrate men's positive contributions to society, community, family, marriage, childcare, and the environment. Number three, to focus on men's health and well-being, social, emotional, physical, and spiritual. Number four, to highlight discrimination against men in areas of social services, social attitudes, expectations, and law. Number five, to improve gender relations and promote gender equality. Number six, to create a safer, better world where people can be safe and grow to reach their full potential. These are the six pillars IMD follows, and we also, Voice of Men 360, also follow. The other thing is we are focusing how we can help our boys and men around our in a local community too. So this is one of the creating platform that keeping awareness, bring people to discuss about men's world matter. So we have a very special guest. Let me give some brief introduction about him. A very interesting person. Andrew Smiler, PhD, is an award-winning author and licensed therapist with expertise in adolescent boys, men, and masculinity. His TEDx talk asked, "What does it mean to be man enough?" And his most recent book asked, "Is masculinity toxic?" Dr. Smiler is a co-founder of the Healthy Masculinity Initiative, a past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities, SPSMM, and a past president of Male Survivor, National Organization Against Male Sexual Victimization. He won SPSMM's Distinguished Professional Service Award in 2016 and a Researcher of the Year Award 2007. Dr. Smiler served as the editor-in-chief of online publication for the Society for Research and Adolescent between 2017 and 2020, treasurer of Male Survivor, and chaired SPSMM's Communications and Media Committee between 2014 and 2016. Let's welcome Mr. Andrew Smiler. Doctor, how are you?
I'm good, Shivam. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, yes. Welcome back. So I want to start with asking you, what was the inspiration or, some influence that happened in your early stage? Let's say if I take you back in 5, 10, 15 years old, for your current position or profession. Can you remember anything?
I'm one of those people that doesn't have a specific event or memory or thing that happened during my childhood that has really landed me in this current position or drives my passion for this. I grew up as a fairly typical, white heterosexual boy in the US. I was nerdy. And I have some serious nerd cred, like math club, chess club, academically gifted, math student of the year. I get some serious nerd cred here. But at the same time, I was growing up in the Philadelphia area in the 70s and 80s and really into sports and, watched sports all the time and played a little bit of backyard ball and stuff like that. But a pretty kind of nondescript childhood. The big thing that did it for me was after once I started to become a therapist and was practicing in the 90s, it dawned on me at some point that the vast majority of the clients who were assigned to work with me in the clinics where I was employed were teenage boys. We had lots of folks on staff, male and female, who wanted to work with younger children. Among the folks who wanted to work with adolescents, I was often the only male therapist on staff, and the female therapists tended to work with the girls, and I tended to work with the guys. And the guys made sense to me, and folks would talk about, I don't know how you can talk to that kid. I'm like, yeah, it's fine. Like, he makes sense to me, and maybe some of that was just having grown up as a boy and learning to think the way that my clients thought. But over the years, and it's coming up on 30 years now that I've been working with boys and men, what's become apparent to me is that most folks who are trained as therapists don't have any real sense of how to work with boys and men. And part of that is that it's a female-dominated field. Part of that is that we don't teach working with boys and men as an element of cultural competence, even though, again, it's a female-dominated field, and that kind of would make sense to teach it as an element of cultural competence.
Sure. One of us have a different influence or inspiration or stories, every part of our life. So we're going to start with, I believe, what is healthy masculinity. We're going to cover 4 areas. He's going to talk about in 4 areas. But let's start with what's healthy masculinity. I think that's where you want to start. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're reminding me we have 4 questions and not a whole lot of time here, so I should probably not talk too fast, but talk fast. As a concept, healthy masculinity is still really in the process of being defined. My colleague Dale Vaughn, who I work with at the Healthy Masculinity Initiative, we in this moment are really talking about a definition that centers on wholeness. So we're talking about helping boys and men achieve both individual and community-oriented goals, instead of being focused just on individual accomplishment, which is what American masculinity has very much become focused on. We're also, as part of this definition of healthy masculinity, we're encouraging boys and men to care for both their body and their mind. And again, in America today, guys will care for their body, but mostly kind of seeing their body as a tool to do other things. If they look good enough, they can attract dating and sexual partners, or they can be the best at some kind of physical task. And we're also, as part of our definition, we're also trying to find ways to encourage men to find meaning, ideally in both work and leisure. We understand that not everyone can find meaning in work. There's a lot of folks who have very kind of banal, meaningless jobs, but to the extent that we can do it, encouraging folks to find meaning in both places, at work and during their leisure time.
Very interesting. Do you see any different pattern with any developing countries, if you look at it in a deeper level?
We're both Americans, and we're going to start where we live here. I do recognize and some of the principles for International Men's Day that you were mentioning at the start of the show really highlight this kind of American or Western version. We focus on body and mind. We don't typically include spirit in that, or we don't explicitly include emotional development. We have trimmed this down to talk about individual and community-oriented goals, but that that is a narrower focus. We don't explicitly talk about broader goals such as changing systems or care for the environment. But again, those are very important things. And I know those are, I'm not going to say they're more relevant in other countries around the world, but they're certainly more obvious in many other countries around the world. Similarly, work has very different meanings in so-called first world or Western nations than it does in some other places, especially some underdeveloped countries. So we do have some kind of bias built into our definition here based on where we're starting out.
Absolutely, I guess so too. So the second area, why should we be talking about healthy masculinity? Why is it important, especially nowadays? Last number of years. Why is it?
We think this is hugely important. Over the last 5, maybe even 10 years, perhaps a little longer than that, we have heard a lot about toxic masculinity. There's certainly a longer standing dialogue about patriarchy and the harms that men have done in various ways. And I really want to parse that out as men in power, because not all men are really perpetrating that harm. But we need a counterpoint. And again, back to the 6 pillars there for IMD, we want to highlight male role models. We want to talk about folks who are doing well, and not just famous people, but folks that a boy or man might know in their everyday life. And so starting to have discussion about healthy masculinity in the broader culture and in the media, we believe furthers that. It's one thing to say, oh, don't be toxic, but don't be toxic doesn't really point guys towards what they should be doing. It just tells them what not to do. And we want to help guys figure out what actually to do instead of just, don't do that, right? If you tell somebody not to take something out of the cookie jar, it's hard to think about anything else. But if you tell them, hey, maybe you should eat a piece of fruit instead, then they have another idea and another direction to go in.
When you talk about role model and leadership, right? I come to know that, especially last, I would say like maybe 5-10 years, especially nowadays or even in the near future, the youth and also, between, I would say like maybe 25 to 35 or even in the 50s too. People are always looking for somebody else. They are not really looking into themselves like, what we can do or what I can do. So what's how that play here? Because every time when we bring somebody else or when we are looking for outside world, who can inspire or who can influence us, it's going to be very hard. What do you say that?
It can be very difficult to find someone who you want to serve as a role model or who you really see as a role model. And yet at the same time, I will tell you in my therapeutic conversation with teen boys and adult men, there are lots of examples, and part of our challenge sometimes is that we are, and again, I'm speaking primarily or almost exclusively from an American context here. Guys are kind of stuck in this split between this cultural definition of what it means to be a man today. And in the US, that's all about being a real man. And so when we ask people about role models, they often kind of use this real man framework. But then when I get to lead group discussions, certainly in my individual therapy work, if I ask guys, do they know anyone who qualifies as a good man? And sometimes and also asking them, what's the difference between a good man and a real man? Then they really start to recognize that there's more than one way to be a man. There's more than one definition of masculinity. And working from this good man standard, it becomes a lot easier for folks to identify role models, folks who they actually look up to and admire and say they want to be like. That definition of a good man tends to focus on things like being responsible, being a man of your word, setting realistic goals and living up to them. For a lot of my clients, and can no longer tell how much this is about the fact that I now live in the American South. Honor and respectability come into that as well. And so when folks use that kind of a definition about honor and respectability and living up to your word and setting and achieving realistic goals, as opposed to this far-flung, I want to be a real man and I want to be the best at my thing, they often know men like that in their real life, whether that's men in their families, fathers, uncles, grandfathers, whatever, men from their places of worship, teachers, coaches, bosses or mentors in the workplace. Those guys aren't hard to find, but oftentimes we don't think in those terms. We tend to think more along the country's current definition of masculinity, which is a much narrower group.
What's the other one is our healthy masculinity and toxic masculinity opposites. Can you explain to that? I mean, it's kind of like interesting, and then I want to know. I want to learn more about that. I had one comment this morning. I will read it to you, but let's discuss this one.
Sure. I think in a very simplistic conversation, we might position toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity as opposites at two different endpoints of a continuum, if you will, with all sorts of stuff in the middle. But the world isn't usually that simple. And I think that neither healthy masculinity or toxic masculinity, these endpoints here, are really simple entities unto themselves. But given that we are very much working on two levels, when we talk to the public, we sometimes position healthy masculinity as the opposite or even the antidote to toxic masculinity. In reality, in a more extended dyadic conversation like you and I are having right now, like, you've heard all of the things that fit into healthy masculinity here, and it's not quite as simple as saying they're opposites. They very much just represent different ideals or different versions of masculinity. And in some ways, the culture has labeled one of those toxic, and we are arguing for one of those as healthy. But I suppose there could be a lot of debate about that as well.
It doesn't matter. It's any culture or any ethnic groups. The culture plays major role. Is that right, Andrew?
Oh, absolutely. Culture shapes the way we think. Some of the anthropologists that I've studied use this computer metaphor that I really like, and I think most folks will get it these days, that our biological inheritance is really the hardware of the computer we buy, and the culture we grow up in or the culture we adapt to is really the operating system. And we all know about operating systems these days. And then kind of the specific things that we do, the habits that we develop, those are really like the apps or the software that we have. But culture absolutely shapes us. It helps us know what kind of clothing to wear and what's appropriate and for whom. It specifies certain color choices in wardrobe. It also, teaches us about religion, because religion is a higher level construct in the way that culture is, and most cultures have a dominant religion. It teaches us what it's like to be a member of a majority or a minority group, depending on what culture we're in and what characteristics we bring. It determines what holidays we celebrate.
Exactly. Let me share this comment when I post this one to one of the group, and then very interesting. I want to share with you.
Sure.
I always wondered why toxic masculinity and there's no toxic femininity. Why not speak about both from positive standpoint? I was asked to speak on toxic masculinity and told the organizers that the topic forces me as a motivational speaker to direct the discussion from a negative angle.
Yeah. I can imagine the difficulty that speaker had started as a motivational speaker and having to focus on the negatives. I do not study femininity. I hang out with women, but I don't. It's not like I said, it's not what I study. I've spent the last 25 years studying masculinity in men and boys. Spent the last almost 30 years now working with boys and men. I don't, formally, I don't know a whole lot about femininity. I've certainly read some of that literature, but not very much. I really don't know why we don't talk about toxic femininity. I'm not exactly sure what that would be, but it's also like that's not my work. If somebody else wants to start putting that out there, by all means go for it. I'm interested in helping men, not so much pointing out women's shortcomings. There's
Just
plenty,
a quick,
plenty of folks who already do that.
just a quick question. Just wondering, have you
Sure.
ever come across in your profession, any female or even a male colleague or anybody talk about toxic femininity or anything related to that?
No, not that I've seen. And I will also share, so I haven't seen anybody talk about toxic femininity. I will also share that this term, toxic masculinity, is really one that, as far as I can tell, developed in the culture, kind of spread through the media. And I don't know if that's social media or new media or kind of our traditional media. But doing research on the term toxic masculinity, like that doesn't really exist. People have been researching kind of what's good and bad about masculinity, how does it contribute to other problems or other benefits for a couple of decades now. But there are no academics, as far as I know, at least not in social sciences, who specialize in toxic masculinity. Like that's not a bit of academic jargon that has come to the public. That's really a public term.
Nice. Before we go to the next area, I want to ask you one thing. When we of course you have worked with, or you have been working with the youth and helping a lot of men in the past, even nowadays too. So do you think, or do you believe that our boys, I mean the youth, the recent generation or the current generation, do they really understand the real meaning of the masculinity?
That's a great question. And there's this embedded assumption in there when you say, do they understand the real definition of masculinity, that we have a real definition of masculinity that everybody has agreed upon. And certainly in the US we don't, which probably isn't surprising given that here in the US we don't seem to agree on much these days, if we ever did. But and I was referencing this before, we have this current definition of masculinity, and we'll talk about that as being a real man, or maybe functioning in the man box. But that term and this conception of masculinity that is all about individual achievement and trying to get power and being able to use violence to get power, and promiscuity as a way to get status and power, or promiscuity as an outcome of having status and power. This is a relatively new definition that came to the fore in the 70s and was really crystallized in the 80s. And we still have it with us. And again, that's what we talk about when we tell guys to man up or to be a real man. But if you go back a little bit prior to that and look at US history from the late 1800s into the 1960s and 1970s, we had a very different standard. We used to encourage boys and men to be good guys, to be stand-up men, and we really focused on character. We talked about things like accountability and responsibility and honesty and participating in their community. It's not surprising that the scouting movement, Boy Scouts of America and scouts in many English-speaking countries, were formed actually at the beginning of this period, in the beginning of the 1900s. And if you look at their credo, which emphasizes honesty and trust and thriftworthiness and helping others, that's really a statement about what masculinity is. That definition of masculinity got kind of pushed aside, but we still have lots of folks here in the US, I imagine around the world, who really endorse that kind of a definition of masculinity, and that's what they live up to. But it's not our real men standard that dominates. So there's not not really a single definition of masculinity here. And when I talk to boys and men, young men about what does it mean to be a man, like all of these different pieces come through, and we start to sort it out about what's important to them. And I'll do a little bit of education about these historical roots as well.
All right, that's. I mean, it's a very big topic, and then we can go 1 hour or 2 hour
Yeah,
discussion. It's a long topic. As you are talking, I was thinking a lot of different areas, but let's go with the last question, and then I have last area, and then I have a few questions. Is healthy
sure.
masculinity possible within the patriarchal system? That's very important to think about it, especially for a middle-aged group or anybody nowadays.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and one that's a little bit challenging to answer because we sometimes run together what it means to be masculine with what it means to be living in a patriarchal system. So if we go back to this good guy standard, it didn't really require men to be sexist or racist or homophobic for that matter, because the focus of masculinity was all on their individual character.
Mhm.
But at the same time, living in a patriarchal system gave those guys, particularly the white heterosexual guys, certain advantages, right? Sexism, which again is part of patriarchy, but was not part of that definition of masculinity, that kept half the populace out of the workplace. It made it easier for guys to get good jobs, to move up the ladder, as they used to talk about, and hope to stay with the company for 30 or 40 or 50 years. Racism kept another 10 or 20% of the population from getting those same jobs. So even though they weren't part of masculinity, they certainly helped some men achieve more so than others. I think it's possible to have a definition of masculinity that's again focused on character and individual worth that is healthy, but doesn't do those. And I think that a lot of guys have actually done that. I think back in the 50s and 60s in the U.S., as we saw the civil rights movement and the starting of the modern women's movement, and then up into the 80s as we saw the gay rights movement start, there were a lot of men, a lot of good men by that slightly older definition, who recognized the rightness of those equality movements, and they stepped up. They joined protests, but at the back, not at the front. They gave money. Men who could do it, shared power and hired women into management positions and hired Black folks into management positions. And you can storm the gates and protest all you want, but ultimately, if you want to get those kinds of corporate positions, there needed to be some white guy that opened the door and said, yes, please join us in the boardroom, or yes, please join us at the management level. And so I think we saw a lot of those good guys really live up to those values within the patriarchy and help kind of dismantle it from the inside.
Yeah, especially the migration or migrated especially last number of years, and also the war makes a huge difference too, internal or anything. So let's talk about your books. Before that,
Sure.
quickly talk about the initiative, the masculinity initiative, healthy masculinity initiative. Can you briefly talk about that, please?
Sure. So along with my colleague Dale Vaughn, we are in the process of starting the Healthy Masculinity Initiative .com. If you look at our website, you'll notice that it looks like it's under construction, and that's because it is. We're in the early launch stage here. We really hope to get going with the beginning of 2021. Our goal is to offer training for folks who work with boys and men, both looking at mental health professionals as well as counselors and as well as coaches and other educators to start with, and helping these professional populations get a better sense of what healthy masculinity might be defined as and how to transmit that knowledge and how to inculcate some of those values in some of the work that they're doing. We are also doing some consulting with programs that already exist and serve boys of whatever age or adult men, to help them also get a more explicit focus on healthy masculinity, again, as we are working through the definition of that. And ultimately, a couple of years down the road, we hope to have a conference. We hope to get a newsletter going. But to start off, we're focusing on this kind of consulting, as well as some consulting in corporate spheres, which is primarily what my colleague Dale does, to help change culture and change it at various levels, really through various forms of education, as well as coaching the coaches, as we're calling it.
Sure. Let's quickly talk about. You have a couple of books. You have written a couple of books. So let's. Can you briefly, touch on those ones? I know it's a very, but we bring it on a different topic too, because it's a long conversation. I want to come back and then discuss on.
Absolutely.
I just want to quickly finish this with these books.
So yeah, let me do the overview here. So my most recent book asks the question: is masculinity toxic? A primer for the 21st century. This is a book that's part of a series by Thames and Hudson Publishers. The series itself is called The Big Idea. These are really beautiful books. They're highly illustrated. They have a fabulous team in-house that really made this the prettiest book I will ever write. I'm only responsible for the text for the most part. But it's a short book. It's a coffee table style book that asks this question: is masculinity toxic? And I will give you the answer, both yes and no. And it goes through some of this history that I've been discussing, and as well as getting into some of the ways that masculinity helps men and masculinity hurts men, and hurts other folks who aren't men. It's a good introduction, and as the title suggests, it's a primer for the 21st century. So it's really meant as an introduction. If you want something a little bit beyond an introduction, I also write a textbook. I co-author that with a good friend of mine, Chris Kilmartin, who is now retired. The textbook is designed to be used in an introduction to men's studies course, but it is definitely written as an academic book. 15 or 16 chapters, covers a broad range of parts of men's lives. And then the two other books that I've written, one is called Challenging Casanova, Beyond the Stereotype of the Promiscuous Young Male. And in some ways, the other book is a sequel. It's called Dating and Sex, A Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy. Both of these books really talk about how we think about male sexuality. Challenging Casanova is really a facts and figures book. It's kind of the target audience there are educated readers who want to hear about the data and get into the data, because this idea that boys and men just want sex is a fabrication. This is part of our image of masculinity that has come to us since the 70s and 80s in the US. It didn't used to be how we thought about male sexuality. And then the second book, Dating and Sex, A Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy, is really a how-to that is written for boys. There are lots of sex ed books that are written for girls. There are lots of sex ed books that are written for anyone, regardless of gender. But mine was the first book that was written for boys and published as written for boys in about 30 years. And I'd actually won a couple of awards, for which I'm very, very honored and flattered. But it talks to boys kind of in this way that American boys are taught to view and understand the world. And it really helps them, because we know that most parents, if they talk to their sons about dating and sex, it tends to be a very short conversation. A lot of boys don't remember it, because about 80% of parents say they've had some conversation, but only about half of high school seniors or university undergraduates say they had that conversation. And the ones who remember it tell us that it probably lasted no more than 10 minutes and really focused on the three don'ts. Don't get anyone pregnant, don't get a disease, and for God's sakes, just don't have sex at all. And that's not really much a of an education for boys, given that the vast majority of them not only are going to date, but ultimately have sex and become parents and get married at some point in their life. So I wanted to write a book that helps fill that gap.
All right. I know it's a long conversation, but it's not really. We cannot finish everything within a half an hour or 30 minutes. It is very hard.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate for coming in and sharing these messages, Andrew. Because we need to have more of this discussion, and it's a deeper conversation we can go. As I said, I was thinking like the religion, the environment, the politics. So many things plays a huge role here. And also, time to time, we see different things happening in our society. Especially last, I would say, like last number of years, 5-10 years. So, and then also the next generation, we don't have any idea how they're going to change too. So it's a very interesting. At the same time, I was thinking to bring at least 3-4 people and then have a kind of like a debate or some kind of different set of discussion. It's going to be a very interesting topic because when we discuss from different angle, we get more into that. So I really appreciate that. Is there anything you want to add before we close?
I will add that if you're interested in the books, you can find them at any bookseller. That is not quite true. The textbook is a little harder to find. The textbook, you need to either access it through my website, which is just my name, andrewsmiler.com, and that's only available by the publisher because it's a textbook, and that's how that works. But both Is Masculinity Toxic and Dating and Sex are available at any bookseller you might prefer.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. So we will have another discussion, one more discussion with him. We're going to have a very good topic some other times in the near future. So once again, thank you, and really appreciate.
Thanks for having me, Shivam. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Friends, thank you for joining. And not only this, but also every week, especially on Saturdays, we bring people from a different walk of life or from different industries or professions to bring some useful or insightful information about boys and men, but not only boys and men, but also some other topics too. Whatever it's relating or useful for our audience and also our community, our society, which will benefit for you guys, though, right? So we have a shows, live talk show on Sundays. Open up wherever, anywhere from any part of the world you can join, and you can share any walks of life. You can come and join. You can share your life stories. When you share your life stories, somebody else on the other end can make a different or make a positive impact, make their mind in a positive ways. So it can be some of the times it can be a challenge, but also when you open your heart and then share, especially men, we don't really open our heart and then share. So this is the time, this is the platform you have, you can share. Another discussion is on Saturdays, as usual, from 10:30 to 11 o'clock, half an hour. And also on Saturdays evening, we have a Tamil talk show from 8:30 to 9 o'clock. That's in Tamil. And also we have another Tamil talk show on Wednesdays from 7:30 to 8 o'clock. On Sundays, especially, I welcome all of you. Whoever wants to join and share your life stories, please reach out to us. You can, of course, find us at Facebook, Voice of Men 360. We have a group, we have a page, and also on YouTube, Voice of Men 360. Please subscribe our YouTube channel. All right. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Take care.